All right, so this is the first video where I'm going to talk through the material from chapter 2. And the thing to know from here on out, the textbook is largely oriented towards sort of a historical view on the psychology of learning. So it starts off at the earliest phases, and it's going to move towards more contemporary views of learning. So this chapter is on early behaviorism, sort of the kind of early stages of psychology, and the psychologists really trying to figure out how to understand what is psychology about and how do we study human behavior. And kind of to kick it off, I have this quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., where he says, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education." And I say that because I hope that you can learn this material, but I also hope that you can apply it wisely, to apply it for transformational purposes, not manipulative purposes, to be a good person with what you learn from this class. And in fact, I think this class is a wonderful gift to being able to be a good parent, to be a good teacher, or a good therapist, or a number of other applications. But I hope that as you go about the process, you think about using this material for good, to help people, to show compassion towards people, and to kind of um, help people develop into good human beings. Okay, so in regards to the material, we're going to have three main figures. We're going to have Pavlov, Watson, and Guthrie that we're going to talk through for this chapter. But to understand Pavlov, it's helpful to go a little bit before Pavlov and understand what was the state of psychology at this time when Pavlov emerged. And so in the late 19th century, there was two main camps in psychology. In Europe, there was a camp called structuralism, and that was largely led by Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener. And then in America, that was largely being led by William James. It was a discipline called functionalism. And you may know the name Wilhelm Wundt because he was the first one to establish a laboratory, a psychology laboratory. He did so in 1879. And you may know William James. He wrote a influential text, The Varieties of Religious Experience, that a lot of pastors have read, where he applied psychology to religion. And so these were the main figures at the time. And they largely, although they understood psychology in different ways, they were largely using one single method, which was introspection. So Wundt believed that the focus of psychology should be on consciousness. And the only way to study consciousness, right, it's this existence inside of our mind, it's our mental life, our awareness. He argued that you could only do it through introspection. But he thought it needed to be trained introspection, that not everyone could do this, that you had to train a person to do an introspective process. So if you have a trained introspector, they would know how to describe this pencil without giving it a name. So they describe the color, the texture, it's got divots in it. They would be able to kind of identify that it has made of wood, it's pink with green metal, and so they'd have an ability to kind of express their mental experience of this pencil. And then Titchener, who studied under Wundt, used introspection to identify certain elements of the mind, kind of understanding that the mind is composed of sensations, images, and affections. So, of course, sensations like the texture, taste, touch, smell, etc. Images like these visual images that we have in our mind, and then affections, we might call them emotions or feelings. And that, again, that's why they called them the structuralists, because they understand these are different structures of the mind. But William James argued that the function of consciousness, not the structure, is more important. And so introspection should try to understand how is consciousness allowing us to adapt to the world around us. Now, introspection has some problems. So there's a reason why we don't use introspection today in psychology. Because the first problem is that introspection is a mental activity, and you're using it to study mental activity. So introspection could therefore interfere with whatever mental activity you're trying to identify. So my impression of this pencil is going to be, I guess, competing against when I try to introspect. I have to also think not just about this pencil, but also about, okay, how do I introspect about my experience of this pencil? So you can see how that gets kind of complicated. And another problem is that oftentimes when we do something, if I were to introspect and try to understand, why did I do what I did? Oftentimes humans have a tendency to create an explanation. So we may say, if we find ourselves scratching here, we might say, oh, I had an itch. It's not that the person necessarily knew that they had an itch there. Sometimes we just find ourselves doing certain things out of habit, and as a result, we say that we are having an experience when maybe we really didn't. And then lastly, the problem of cognitive biases can come in. So one example is the confirmation bias. So if we believe that we have a certain structure or function to our consciousness, we're probably going to be more attuned to basically replicate our own past findings. And so that can be a problem for introspection. Now, these two camps weren't the only ways of looking at psychology or going about psychology, but they were very influential. There were some, though, who focused on a different aspect of the mind, and they called it psychophysics, right? So physics was an established science. The early psychologists wanted to be scientists, and so they wanted to sort of connect with a scientific field. And so in Germany and America, there was another practice of psychophysics where they were trying to measure the various amounts of stimulation for sensation. So one element was the absolute threshold. Okay, so if I were to just gently, I'm trying to do it as gently as I can, have this pencil touch my finger, there's some point where it may be touching, but I might not feel it. And then there's another point where, you know what, I'm definitely feeling that. And there's a point at which half the time there's a force where I'm going to detect, oh, if I couldn't see, if I couldn't hear, or had no other access, the tactile sensation of, oh, I have something is touching me right now, I'd be able to detect it 50% of the time. The psychophysics, they called that the absolute threshold. And so they found this interesting, and they could find it for each sensation. Can you hear a tone? Well, there's a point where it's so faint, but you can hear it half of the time. And that would be the absolute threshold for hearing. Or a light. If you're in a completely dark room, can you tell that there's a light being introduced? Well, there's a point where the light is just so small, so faint, you can actually detect it, again, half of the time. Another concept that they just looked at in this field was the idea of the just noticeable difference. So which is called the JND, the acronym. The JND is the least amount of change in stimulation that would be noticeable. So imagine if you were holding a weight and the weight was 1 pound, and then if someone were to add an additional pound to whatever you were holding, you'd probably notice it, because 1 pound increasing into 2 pounds is a relatively a large jump. But then imagine if you have a 50-pound weight, you're just really straining, holding onto that, and imagine if someone put another pound on top of that, so it's now 51 pounds. Well, you might not notice that. It might be so intense already that you might not notice that there was a change. And that's the idea of the just noticeable difference, that at different intensities, we have different capacity to detect change. So in the same way for light, let's say you have a one candle, and then you add in another candle. If you cannot see the candles itself, but you might be able to notice, oh, the room just got brighter. But if you had 1,000 candles and then you lit one more candle, you probably wouldn't notice an additional candle. So again, that would not be a just noticeable difference. And a researcher named Weber found that J and Ds are a constant proportion of a stimulus. So it's a linear relationship. And I've got a graph of it here. So basically, as the intensity of stimulation increases, so let's say if this is the weight of some object, or the intensity of light, or the sound, whatever it is, as that increases, the ability to detect change well, you need a greater magnitude of change in order to be able to detect it. So at a stimulus intensity of 2, you can detect a magnitude 5 change, but if it is a intensity of 5, that's not high enough. So you need a greater magnitude of change to be able to detect this change. Okay, so these aren't really critical for our understanding for this class, but again, this work sort of is the context for the rest of it's the context for where psychology was at this time. And so at this time, roughly at the turn of the century, that's in about 1900, that's when Pavlov, who you've probably heard of, Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, started conducting his experiments on classical conditioning. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about Pavlov, kind of help you understand who he was. He was a Russian, and he initially set out to become a priest like his father. And so he was going to follow in his father's footsteps, but while he was in seminary, he was reading kind of broadly, and he actually became fascinated with Russian translations of various scientific writings that were influenced by Darwin. So evolutionary, biological writings on natural selection, things like that. So he ended up leaving the seminary so that he could pursue animal physiology and medicine. And he studied at St. Petersburg. So he was engaged in this work, and he was largely a physiologist. So he didn't identify as a psychologist. And as he was doing that, he insisted that he was a physiologist, and he actually fined any laboratory assistant who described what they were observing in psychological terms rather than physiological terms. Okay, now I imagine that you're somewhat familiar with Pavlov's work, and it was actually the result of some accidents. So he was studying the process of the role of salivation in the digestive process. And while he was doing that, okay, so he's looking at saliva, how does it help break down food? Well, what he noticed is that some dogs started to salivate before the food was even in front of them. So as he noticed this, he began to realize, oh, this is This is important. This is significant. This is an adaptation, kind of using evolutionary terms. This is an adaptation of an organism to kind of prepare them for digestion. And that's where he shifted and said, okay, we need to study this. So Pavlov showed that not only the sight of food, but any distinctive stimulus could bring about salivation if it was paired with the food often enough. Okay, so again, here's kind of the starting point. Um, the dogs brought out the dogs would see food, and the food would cause them to salivate. But then, of course, the food was typically brought in by one of the handlers, and the handler uh, was present with the food. And eventually, what they found is that the handler alone could cause the dog to salivate. Okay, and so Pavlov developed some terminology. You may not like it. I'm not the biggest fan of the terminology, but but you probably heard this in general psychology if you took it, which is he referred to the food as an unconditioned stimulus. So we abbreviate that as US. And then the salivation in response to the food, he called an unconditioned response. So an unconditioned response is an automatic response. There's no learning present, right? So this is a psychology of learning. The unconditioned response is not a process of learning. I find it a little bit helpful. So you could think of it this way if it helps you. But instead of unconditioned, I like to replace it with unlearned. So you have the unlearned stimulus and the unlearned response. The response that is unlearned is one that is automatic. It's instinctual. It's present from birth essentially, and I find that a little bit easier to understand. Okay, so that's the starting point. But he noticed that if a buzzer or a bell, right? Often we talk about it as a bell, but if a buzzer sounded every time the food is presented to the dog, the buzzer, which he called a conditioned stimulus, or again a learned stimulus, will actually elicit the response of salivation, which is he called a conditioned response. So it's a little tricky. Let me say something about that. So the unconditioned response is salivation, and the conditioned response is salivation. But the reason why you call it a conditioned response is because it's salivation in response to the buzzer or the conditioned stimulus and not to the food. So you can only really prove that it's a conditioned response when you don't bring food out. And so you ring the buzzer and you notice, oh, the dog is salivating just with the buzzer. Okay, so it's kind of hard to imagine how do you measure salivation. So this diagram shows what it would look like to actually run this study. So you obviously Pavlov would kind of harness the dog so that they're not moving around much. The dogs, you could see that there's a little tube coming out of the side. So they would surgically implant this tube into the parotid gland, and basically when the dog was salivating, saliva would come down the tube, and then they had a little mechanism that would monitor how much salivation is flowing through the tube, and that monitor would you could see the circular I forget what it's called, the revolving drum that sort of monitors how much saliva. So if the dog was salivating a lot, it would have a greater amplitude, and if it wasn't salivating, it would be lower. And so this is a little bit concerning. It certainly sounds bad, right? If you like dogs, most people aren't a fan of this design, right? Implanting a tube into their cheek. But surprisingly enough, Pavlov actually did this with some children. So he actually would do this to children and measure their salivation and kind of found that they can be classically conditioned to salivate as well. So there's obviously some ethical questions about his work, but okay, so this diagram kind of walks you through the classical conditioning process. So before conditioning, okay, you ring a buzzer and there's not really a response, right? At least there's no salivation response. The dog maybe go, oh, what's that buzzer? But that's about it. But the food itself, it was an unconditioned stimulus. And so it's a US, and it therefore elicits an unconditioned response of salivation. At this phase, we call the buzzer an NS because it's not a conditioned stimulus yet. It's not been conditioned. It's just a neutral stimulus. Now, after the buzzer has gone off while the food is being brought out, the buzzer becomes a conditioned stimulus. And when that process is finished, after it's been done multiple times, and Pavlov had to do this hundreds of times in some cases, the buzzer itself could actually elicit the salivation. So the CS, the buzzer, elicited the CR, the conditioned response, the learned response of salivation. You could also think about this as a independent variable and a dependent variable. So the independent variable is how much the buzzer has been conditioned with the food, and the dependent variable is the amount of salivation when there's no food present, and so it's the conditioned response. These are this is of course the typical one, but classical conditioning has been done in other contexts as well. A few examples. If you insert, and this is kind of an interesting one, I don't know why they chose this, but if you insert air directly into a person's bladder, it will cause that person to urinate. And if you pair a bell with that air, then the bell can actually elicit urination. So even without inserting the air, just hearing the bell after they've been conditioned, it can cause them to urinate. So again, if you're trying to train a person to control their bladder process, then that could be helpful. Another example is if you hold one hand in a bucket of cold water, we know that the other hand actually will drop in temperature too. So, but we also know if you use a buzzer, so every time you put your hand in the water, a buzzer will go off. Well, then eventually the buzzer itself can cause a drop in temperature in this hand. And so just hearing a buzzer, again, if you take away the bucket of cold water, just hearing a buzzer can make this hand drop in temperature. So interesting. And then finally, another example, an amber colored light. So just imagine a light bulb with sort of an amber, like a really warm amber color. They did a study with female college students where they had this light and then also erotic videos, pornographic videos. And what they found is that the amber light, if you just turn on after they've been conditioned, it can actually evoke sexual arousal in women. So kind of an interesting study. Okay, so what's the application? Obviously, most of us don't care about salivation or getting people to having their hand temperature drop or their bladder urinating at the response to a bell. So the idea of classical conditioning is that human beings have a number of reflexes. These are simple, non-intentional, unlearned behaviors. So they're pre-wired stimulus response units, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response units. And we know that humans are born with a number of reflexes. So at birth, a newborn infant, if you put a finger or anything in their mouth, they'll naturally, reflexively suck on that. Another one that you may have heard of is called the Moro reflex. So if you take an infant and sort of drop your hands a little bit while you're holding them, get them to obviously not drop them, but get them to feel like they're dropping. They will put their hands out and kind of spread out a little bit, and they call that the Moro reflex. If you've been to the doctor's office where they hit your kneecap, you know that there's a knee jerk reflex. Another one is the Eyeblink reflex. So if you have a puff of air, you will instinctively blink. And then pupillary reflex, like our pupils will dilate and constrict, and that happens reflexively. So reflexes can be classically conditioned. So anytime where there's an automatic response, unlearned response, that unlearned response can be conditioned with some other neutral stimulus. So I've got a couple other examples, not from the textbook, but I found them to be helpful. So one that's been used often, surprisingly, in research on classical conditioning is Quail Sex Conditioning. So in Quail Sex Conditioning, you could see a quail's placed in this compartment, and there's a light, and then there's a door, and then there's a side compartment containing a female. So this would be a male quail, and the light. Okay, so what's the unconditioned response here? Anytime a male quail is exposed to a female, it will innately produce arousal. And again, that's the unconditioned response. They don't have to learn this. It's an instinct, a reflex. But the light, the light, or sometimes they use a tone, that's a conditioned stimulus. It's initially neutral. They don't really have a response to the light. But after the CS is paired with the US, after the light comes on and then this compartment opens up so they have access to the female, then the CS itself, the light, comes to produce a conditioned response, an approach behavior, so that the quail will come to the door and they'll approach it and be they'll basically prepare for having sex. And so this is a sort of appetitive conditioning. It's a reflex that prepares the quail to obtain essentially the sex with the female quail. Another example, odor conditioning. So if you expose these are fruit flies, and what they did is they would, I'm going to bring up all the text here. They exposed them, they put them in two containers, and in one container there was a particular odor, and then there was another odor. So on one side it might smell like almond, and then another it might smell like another sort of spice, anise. And when they're in this particular this first chamber, this first tube, if they smell a particular odor, they could be shocked. Okay, and then what they do is they put them in this larger compartment that one end has the anise odor and the other has the almond odor. They'll go to the side of the compartment where they didn't that has the odor that wasn't associated with the shock. So the odor and the shock kind of get paired together. And surprisingly, this actually works with only a single trial. You don't have to do this repeatedly. Most of the time with appetitive conditioning, you have to do it repeatedly. But with aversive conditioning, a single trial can sometimes be enough to condition them. And the idea is it helps in this case, fruit fly or the organism avoid a unpleasant, unconditioned stimulus. Finally, a third example of classical conditioning. Again, I'm trying to get you seeing some examples of this to understand it a little bit more. Is we know that if you put a puff of air to the eye, it innately produces an eye blink. Now, if you use a tone or a light to signal, so if you present it before the puff of air, it can actually produce an eye closure, basically an eye blink, very similar to the eye blink with the puff of air. And so this again is a form of aversive conditioning. The tone or the light, the conditioned stimulus, causes you to close your eyes so that you don't get the puff of air. And it works on rabbits and on humans, but actually takes many trials. Interestingly enough, humans, we blink a lot, and so it's kind of hard to condition this because sometimes we'll just blink before we even know a puff of air is coming. But rabbits don't blink very often, and so it works more quickly with rabbits to train them on this sort of eye blink conditioning. Okay, so stepping back to Pavlov, what Pavlov showed is that if you have an automatic reflex, it can shift from a US to a CS if paired often enough. So basically, the salivation response could shift from food to a bell or a buzzer, and all it took is just pairing them together. That's all it required. Now we know now that classical conditioning is more complex. It's not just about shifting a reflex. I'll come back to that in a later video from this very chapter. But basically, it's this idea that we simply have to pair things together. So more contemporary views of classical conditioning, think of it more as a form of signal learning. We're learning to predict what's coming. It's this idea that the CS is a signal that the US is coming. Okay, thinking about Pavlov's dogs, the CS, the bell or the buzzer, is a signal that shows, oh, guess what? The food is coming, and so you can think of it as classical conditioning. It's really about preparing for the future and making sure that you're ready to adapt to the situations that are coming. Okay, now I've given you some research examples. What about just more practical examples? So you'll know from experience that if you ever go into a kitchen, your kitchen, you might suddenly, even if you weren't hungry when you entered the kitchen, you might become hungry. Why? Well, the kitchen's a neutral stimulus, but when you're in the kitchen, you're often smelling food and eating, and as a result, you've associated the kitchen with feeling hunger. Another example, certain songs. You might have songs that are associated with sexual arousal, or really just all sorts of things. If you may have songs that trigger memories in your life, or particular people that you've dated, or things like that, and that's a process of classical conditioning. Yeah, I've got another example, less real life, but yeah, blood vessels constrict if you put a cold pack on, and you can actually condition a person to have their blood vessels constrict by simply playing a buzzer every time you put the cold pack on. So we know actually that there's what we call interoceptive conditioning, where we can condition our glands or muscles to respond in particular ways, which is pretty cool. And then finally, another example, taste aversion. So if you've ever had a new food and have gotten food poisoning from it, so let's say you eat oysters and you get food poisoning from it, you're likely, it's quite possible that you develop a taste aversion to that particular food, especially if it was a new food that you've never tried before. So it's basically pairing up the food itself wasn't what got you sick. It was whatever bacteria or virus was in the food, but the food was associated with that bacteria or virus, and as a result, you get that same disgust, nauseous feeling from the food, the idea of the food, the taste of the food, the sight of the food. It gets paired up with the nausea, so that you feel like you cannot eat that food. Um, all right, so I hope by now you kind of get a picture of what classical conditioning is all about. But like, it's also helpful to understand what's the process, what determines that classical conditioning occurs. So the key to classical conditioning is what we call contiguity. It needs to be contiguous. Contiguity has to do with closeness in time. Basically, the CS and the US have to occur basically simultaneously or nearly simultaneously. So we're talking about seconds. This is not like sufficient to be minutes apart. You need to be very close in time. And what we found with classical conditioning, all it takes is for the two events to be together and behavior can start to change. Now, I have here also another concept called reinforcement. So you've probably heard of it, but the thing to note is that reinforcement is not a part of classical conditioning. So it actually has to do with what we'll talk about in chapters 3 and 4, operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning. And reinforcement is about what happens after a behavior. And it's a question of what are the effects of a behavior. And so you've heard of things like positive reinforcement, and then of course punishment, and that's a little bit different. So what I want you to learn is classical conditioning is all about contiguity. It's not about reinforcement. So you can actually have some variations in contiguity. So there's a few different ones here. So the first one would be simultaneous pairing. All right. This is where, so the question is, for most unconditioned stimuli and conditioned stimuli, there's a start and then there's an end. So you can bring out the food. When it comes out, that's the start. And when it's sort of taken away or eaten, that's the end. And the same thing with the bell. There's a start when you hear the bell and then an end when the bell stops. So simultaneous pairing is where the CS and the US start and end at exactly the same time. So basically, if Pavlov were to have done this, the whole time the food was out, there'd be the bell would be ringing. The second idea is called delayed pairing. And this is where the CS is presented before the US. But it's the key to delayed pairing is that the CS starts before the US, but it doesn't end before the US. It continues. So a bell would be rung, 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 and it's still ringing, and then they bring out the food. And the food is present, and they're still ringing the bell. That's delayed pairing. Then the third type is trace pairing, and this is where the bell rings, and then they stop, and usually there's not a very long time, but there's maybe a brief time lapse, and then the food comes out. Trace pairing and delayed pairing, people sometimes get those confused. Trace pairing, there's a concept called a memory trace. So you have to hold something in mind. You have to sort of keep it in your memory. And so trace pairing is referring to the fact that you have to maintain a memory of, oh yeah, I just heard a bell. It ended just a moment ago. And that's why they call it trace pairing. Finally, the fourth one is backward pairing. So this one is where they might bring out the food and then they ring the bell. Okay, but not all these different types of pairing are equal. So the next slide starts off at the top. The top is the most effective way to do classical conditioning, and then trace is second, simultaneous is third, and the fourth, or the worst way to do classical conditioning, is the backward pairing. So again, delayed pairing, you start the conditioned stimulus, so it might be the bell, and it begins here, and then you could see that this is the passing of time. So they ring the bell, and then they bring out the food, but they're still ringing the bell, and then the food goes away, and it ends. This is most effective. That's the best way to do classical conditioning. Again, the second best is trace. So they ring the bell, and then the bell stops, and then the food comes out kind of immediately after. Simultaneous is the third best, and this is where the bell and the food come out at exactly the same time. And so that works, but not particularly well. The worst is backward conditioning. And this one is where, again, the food comes out first and then the bell comes out. So they won't, most of the time, a dog won't salivate to the bell if the bell was rung after the food came out. Okay, so just one more note about backward conditioning. It was long thought to be completely ineffective. It is, in fact, the least effective, but some researchers have been able to bring it about. So in certain circumstances, they can do backward conditioning. And yeah, just a slight note about biology. Certainly there's some things that are more easily conditioned than others. Like I said, for the eye puff conditioning, rabbits are better equipped to develop a be air puff condition, so that they will blink in response to the neutral or the conditioned stimulus. And they're better than humans at doing that. So biology is a factor in the classical conditioning process. Now, the major phases of classical conditioning, there's basically two major phases: the acquisition phase and then the extinction phase. So acquisition is where the CS and US are both occurring. It's where there's, again, both of them are being presented together. And you could see here, okay, basically the takeaway from this graph is the more times you pair up the CS with the US, the stronger the condition response will be. So if you only pair up the CS with the US, a dozen times, you're not going to get as strong of a response as if you did it 100 times or 500 times. So it's a curvilinear relationship. Let's see here. The second factor is the strength of the US. So if the food or the puff of air is really strong to the rabbit's eye, they're going to be more quickly, they're going to learn to predict that puff of air. And so again, there's some processes that affect acquisition. And then there's extinction. So classically conditioned responses, how do you eliminate them? Well, Pavlov found that there's a process called extinction, and basically it's real simple. Just present the conditioned stimulus repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus. So just ring that bell without bringing out the food. Or if you're talking about the Eyeblink conditioning, light up that light or play that tone without puffing, sending the air puff. And what you'll find is that over time, the organism will decrease their response to the conditioned stimulus. Now, that is the general process, but there's an interesting finding, and it is that if you, let's say you extinguish a puff of air. So let's say that the light comes on and then the puff of air. Light comes on, puff of air. Okay, it's been acquired, and now the light comes on, no puff of air. Light comes on, no puff of air. Light comes on, no puff of air. Gradually, the rabbit stops blinking in response to the light coming on. But what if you waited a few days? If you tested them again, you turn on the light, that rabbit would probably blink. Turn on the light, that rabbit would blink. There's a process what Pavlov called spontaneous recovery. So although the rabbit had extinguished this response, it comes back a few days later. And so it looks a little bit like this. On day one, there's an extinction process. So they turn on the light and turn on the light and turn on the light and turn on the light, and gradually there's less and less of a blink in response to the light. But then they wait a few days, and day four, the first time they do it on day four, they turn on the light, the rabbit blinks again. Again, we thought they were extinguished, but it comes back. And so you have to extinguish it again, over and over. Okay, day seven, same thing. And so it takes a while for a conditioned response to go away. I like to point out that if you're talking about like drug addiction, so if you've developed a craving in response to different triggers, yeah, you can extinguish that response, but sometimes the craving can come back, and then the craving can come back. So it's kind of true. Once an addict, always an addict. Once you have a conditioned response to certain triggers, it's hard to extinguish it altogether. You can notice there's a pattern where it gets less and less, but again, spontaneous recovery means it can come back, and it can come back sometimes pretty strong. We'll talk about addiction at a later point in this chapter, but there's some really interesting things from classical conditioning that relate to addiction. All right, a few more findings related to classical conditioning. So there's the idea of stimulus generalization. So what happens, I mentioned that there's a buzzer for Pavlov's dogs. So let's say they have a 1,000 hertz tone. Food, and then the food comes out. What happens if there's a 1,200 hertz tone? Food. All right, I don't know how well my voice controlled it, but there's a difference in the frequency there. What will happen? Well, we know that animals and organisms, there's some generalization that occur. The dog would probably salivate, even though that tone's a little bit different. Their salivation response would generalize. At the same time, they would be salivating less. So there is a process of discrimination. So the further away you get from that particular tone that they've been conditioned with, the less that they will respond to it. So if you have this tone, that might be different enough where they are not going to have much of a response to it. And so there's a discrimination process that goes through. And lastly, in regards to classical conditioning, we know that there can be higher order conditioning. So once you have a conditioned stimulus, you can almost treat it like an unconditioned stimulus. If it's really hardwired, you can basically pair another conditioned stimulus to that conditioned stimulus, and you can kind of combine that a little bit. Okay, so this idea that Pavlov introduces, it basically says our behavior is an automatic response to a stimulus. We don't think, at least in some circumstances, the dogs aren't deciding or thinking about salivating and deciding to act that way. It's just an automatic response. And it's an automatic response to their environment. So in some ways, with classical condition, their environment is controlling their behavior, which is kind of interesting to think about what determines our behavior. Usually we think, oh, I'm in charge, I choose how I behave. Well, in some cases, and addiction's a good example of this, some of our behaviors are the result of our environment around us. We have responses, physiological responses, psychological responses that seem to happen outside of conscious awareness. In fact, some of these can actually occur even with conscious awareness. So you can have a classically conditioned response, and it can still occur even if you know that you're being conditioned. And that's, I don't know, really interesting. It suggests that at least some of the time, our behavior is just a kind of an automatic response to our situation. And I think that's important for us to recognize when we think about what is a person. Some of the times, maybe a person's behavior is the result of a thinking process, but some of it seems to be just an automatic response to our environment. And again, I think we need to appreciate that about humans, and trying to understand their behavior and recognize that sometimes that's the case. And this is the last slide for this video. So what are the spiritual implications of classical conditioning? I've thought about this idea. Is our image of God classically conditioned? All it takes is sort of a neutral stimulus and then a unconditioned stimulus. So for instance, food is associated with hunger. So in praying before a meal, there's a sense that I'm connecting the idea of God and talking to God with food, and therefore I might have an experience where I connect faith with hunger. It's kind of interesting because we think of metaphors of hunger in relationship with like our understanding of God. Another example, if you sing worship songs, praise songs, some songs can really invoke a emotional response out of us, and they can kind of carry us up and lift us up, and we have a sort of an emotional ecstasy. And it's interesting to think about these songs as if like, well, some of this is just the music itself. The music has an emotional response, emotional automatic reflex. We have an automatic reflex to the music. So in singing a song about God and having this music, we're associating God with emotional ecstasy. Now I say all that not to suggest that, certainly not to suggest that God isn't real, but just recognizing that God created us with bodies and a psychology, and he created us with this capacity for classical conditioning. So one of the ways we come to know God is through classical conditioning. It doesn't feel particularly spiritual to say that, but it just sort of recognizes that this is the body that God has given us and the psychology that God has given us. And so perhaps it's just the mechanism that God has allowed us to have in order to get to know who he is. It doesn't mean that God is not real. And of course, it doesn't mean that God is real, but it just seems to reflect how we come to know God. And I say that with this idea, like this also means that some of our understandings of God could actually be in error, because sometimes we could be classically conditioned to associate God with certain things that are not reflective of who God actually is. And so some atheists associate God with war and with suffering, and come to believe that God causes these things. And obviously, I think that's false. And so classical conditioning can help us understand positive aspects of God. It can also potentially make us believe negative aspects of God. So again, I think it does connect in some ways to our spirituality and our faith. So I'll end on that somewhat controversial note, and we'll come back and talk through John Watson. And so I'll end there. Okay.